Now let's look at a second great feature of the arrow function, and that would be the fact that in the body of a arrow function, this keyword is going to point to a containing scope, and it's going to be easier for me to show you than to explain this. So let's go ahead and let's create first a variable. So let's do const and let's call this variable clock, and we're going to be creating a new object. Now the object is going to have one property with a time, which we're going to set equal to 0, and then we're going to have a stopwatch method. So stopwatch, and since this is going to be the method, we're going to set it equal to a function. Now this function is not going to take any parameters, and in fact, only thing we're going to do is we're going to set up a set interval method, which every second is going to be calling this time, and we're going to be adding something to this time property. So let's do set interval. So set interval. Now for the set interval, we also need to pass a callback function. So again, let's do function. And in this case, let's just do a console log and this dot time. So we have the time, and we would want every second add something to the time and console log it. So console log this dot time plus plus, and over here, let's add that this is going to be every second. And if I'm going to go and call this method, so if we're going to have as a clock stopwatch, guess what's going to happen? Well, we have the object. Now within the object, we know that this is going to be pointing to back to the object. So each and every instance of the object, we're going to be having a this that points back to object itself. So in our case, we're selecting this that time. So this should be a property. However, once we call it, notice what's going to happen. I'll have a not a number, not a number. So something is wrong. And the best way for us to actually discover this would be console logging this. So we know that we have the property, then we have the method. So let's do a console log, and let's figure out what is this referencing to. So in our case, we'll have console log this, and whether this is going to be referencing the object. And then let's do the same thing as we're in the function over here. So let's do again console log this, and notice the difference. So first I'm going to have a stopwatch. So let me just call it first. And now I notice one thing. So the first time I'm console logging, this would be in the beginning of a stopwatch method. I'm referencing the object. However, once I'm in the anonymous function, this now references a global window object. So it would be the same thing as I would be calling this set interval outside of the method of stopwatch. So I would need to bound somehow or bind this keyword back to the object. So the old way would be of creating a new variable. So we can just do const, and let's say we'll call this self, and we're going to set it equal to this. Now, once I have this self, I can use this self within the anonymous function. And instead of console logging this, let's do self. And also let's change this to self. And now everything should be working fine. So once I save it, you notice I'm referencing the object. And now once I'm referencing back the object within my anonymous function, everything is working fine. So each and every second, I'm referencing the property of time, and I'm adding by 1. So maybe let me comment out the self and the this console logs, and we're just going to see that every second we're adding each and every number. Well, whenever we're using the arrow functions, we can skip the step of assigning a variable to this, because in the body of arrow function, this is going to point to a containing scope. So let's look at how it's going to look like. So let me comment this out, the clock, and let me create another one. And again, let me go back. I didn't want to delete it. And let's do it const, and this is going to be the clock. Now again, we're going to do the same thing where time is going to be our property. Then time is going to be set equal to 0. And again, we're going to do the same thing where we have a stopwatch. So let's do a stopwatch method. And over here, const clock, we need to assign it to a object. So stopwatch, and the stopwatch is again going to be equal to a function. So we're going to set it equal to a function. However, in this case, again, we're going to be using a anonymous function. And then within the stopwatch, we're going to use again the set interval. However, for the set interval, we're going to use the anonymous function. Now, in our case, we're not accepting any parameters, so we can just have the empty parentheses. Then we're going to use the fat arrow function. And here within the function body, we're going to write what we would want to do. So in our case, we're going to console log it, and we're going to be referencing this. So we can say this time plus plus over here. And once I save it again, now you notice that console log is not running. However, now I would need to invoke the function. So let me go back and let's say over here clock. Now for the clock, I would want to use the stopwatch method. And once I run the function, notice what happens. Again, it's the same thing. Pretty much every second as I'm running this. However, I didn't add the seconds, so that's my mistake. Let me go back and let me add where are the seconds. So how often I would want to call this. And let's say in our case, we're going to do every second. So once I run it, again, every second we're going to be calling this. So I didn't need to reassign the value of this because in the body of an arrow function, this keyword is going to be pointing to a containing scope. Now, in our case, containing scope is going to be the clock object, not a global object. Now also, let's look at how we can deal with a event listeners, since again, it's going to be happening the same thing with event listeners because they might be pointing to a different scope. So let's start with commenting out the clock. So let's do this first. Let's comment this out and let's just maybe point it down. So let's bring everything down and let's work with a event listener. Now for the event listener, we're going to use the object constructor instead. So let's create a function. Let's say that this object constructor function or constructor function is going to be accepting one parameter. And then within the function body, we're going to say this dot number. So this property is going to be equal to the number. So far, so good. Then next, we're going to add a method to a prototype of this constructor function. So let's do UA prototype, UI. And then for the prototype, we would want to add the method. So we're going to call this add number. And we're going to set it equal to a function. In our case, we're going to use the anonymous function. And then again, within this function, we would want to target a button. And then once we target a button, we also would want to add this dot number. So again, we would want to do the same thing. We have the method for a constructor function, and we would want this method to point back and add the property that is on the constructor function. So let's go back over here and let's say that instead of set interval, we would just want to first select a button. So document get element by ID. In our case, this is going to be the same button. So we're going to say btn, and then again, we're going to use the add event listener, and I'm going to be using for a click event. Now again, the old way, if we wouldn't be using a arrow function, this wouldn't be working. So again, let's test it out. So we have a function, then within the callback function, we're going to say console log, and we're just going to say this dot number, in our case plus plus. So again, each and every time we're going to be clicking in the button, we would want to add 1 to the number. So if I'm going to create a new instance, so I'm going to say UI, and this is going to be equal to new EI, and we're going to pass a 0 number, and then we can call the method. And the method is on a prototype, so it is accessible for the instance. So we're going to say UI, and we're going to have add a number. And check it out what happens. Every time I'm going to be clicking, it's going to say again that is not a number. And again, we can do the same thing where we can test it out. What is this referencing to? So let's do this dot log, and let's do the same thing again over here. So again, log and this, just to see where this is pointing to. So as you notice, the first time I run the add number method, this is pointing to my constructor function. However, once I click it, same thing happens. Again, this is pointing to a button. So this is not pointing back to a constructor function. So again, the same way, we would need to fix it where this anonymous function is not going to be pointing to a button. In fact, this is going to be pointing to our constructor function. So again, we do the same thing. We just transfer it into fat arrow function. So in this case, we're just going to change it around. And now once I call it, this should be referencing saying the object. And sure enough, now we have the constructor function and the number is 0, number 0. However, as I click it, now the number is going to be the 1, and we just keep on going, and we're going to keep on adding the number. So this is the great feature of the arrow functions, where the this keyword is going to be pointing to a containing scope.